Some heartbreaks cut so deep they change the course of your entire life. Miss Cora Bell learned this the hard way when she was left standing alone at the altar, her wedding dress a mockery of dreams that would never come true. The banker's son had found himself a richer bride back east, leaving Cora to face the whispers and pitying glances of Dead River's townspeople. That same week, the Ladies' Aid Society held their annual Cowboy auction, where women bid on bachelors for a day's work. Out of pure defiance, Cora bid on the last man standing, a mysterious drifter named Boone. Tall as a pine tree and quiet as morning mist, he carried secrets in his dark eyes and gentle strength in his weathered hands. But what would happen when her former fiancé returned, begging forgiveness? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Bell Ranch as Cora stood on the sagging porch, clutching her father's coffee cup like a lifeline. The ranch, deed yellowed with age and worry, lay spread across the kitchen table behind her, its edges worn smooth by countless anxious fingers. That piece of paper represented 3 generations of Bell, blood, sweat, and dreams, and now it felt as fragile as her own broken heart. Dead River, Colorado Territory, wasn't much to look at in the autumn of 1887. A handful of weathered buildings clustered around a main street that turned to mud with the first rain and dust with the first wind. The town had earned its name honestly. The river that once brought life to the valley had shifted course 20 years back, leaving behind a trickle that barely supported the remaining families. Those who could afford to leave had already gone. Those who stayed either couldn't afford to go or were too stubborn to admit defeat. Cora fell into the latter category, though some days she wondered if stubbornness was just another word for foolishness. "Cora, honey, you're letting the morning get cold," her father called from inside. Samuel Bell's voice carried the weight of his 73 years, each word careful and measured, like he was rationing them. The lung fever had taken most of his strength over the past winter, leaving him a shadow of the man who'd once driven cattle across 3 territories. She turned to find him shuffling toward the table, his frame bent, but his eyes still sharp as blue steel. Those eyes had seen wagon trains and Indian raids, boom towns and busted dreams. They'd watched his wife die in childbirth with their second child, a son, who'd followed his mother within the week. Now they watched his only surviving child with a mixture of pride and worry that never quite faded. "Papa, you should be resting," Cora said, setting down her cup and moving to help him into his chair. Dr. Morrison says a lot of things." Samuel interrupted with a wave of his gnarled hand. "Most of 'em involve me acting like I'm already dead. I ain't ready for that conversation just yet." Cora smiled despite herself. Her father had been having variations of this same argument with every doctor in 3 counties for the better part of a year. The lung fever had weakened him, true enough, but it hadn't touched his spirit. That spirit had been forged in the fires of frontier life, tempered by loss and hardship until it became something unbreakable. "Besides," Samuel continued, eyeing the deed on the table, "we got bigger problems than my coffin fits. Charlie Henderson was by yesterday while you were in town. Says he's still interested in buying the north pasture." Cora's jaw tightened. Charlie Henderson owned the largest spread in the county, and he'd been circling the Bell Ranch like a vulture for months. He was also the father of Thomas Henderson, neighboring rancher, who'd been paying entirely too much attention to Cora since her humiliation at the church steps. "What did you tell him?" "Same thing I told him last time. Bellland stays with the Bells." Samuel's voice carried the finality of a judge's gavel. "But I ain't blind, daughter. I see how the numbers add up, or rather, how they don't." The truth hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. The ranch was failing, had been failing for years. The cattle had been sold off piece by piece to pay debts and doctor bills. The fence lines needed repair, the barn roof leaked, and the well was running low. Without a miracle or a windfall, they'd be forced to sell by spring. "There's another way," Cora said quietly, though the words tasted like ash in her mouth. "Thomas Henderson's been..." persistent in his attentions. Samuel's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger or might have been grief. That boy's got about as much substance as morning mist. He's looking for a wife the same way his daddy looks for land something to acquire and improve upon. That ain't love, Cora. That's business. Maybe business is what I need right now, Cora replied, though her heart rebelled against the words. Maybe I've had enough of waiting for love to find me. Her father reached across the table and covered her hand with his own. His skin was paper-thin and marked with liver spots, but his grip was still strong. Your mama used to say that the heart knows what it needs before the mind figures it out. She was right about most things, and I suspect she was right about that too. Cora felt the familiar ache that came with talk of her mother. Elizabeth Bell had been dead for 24 years, but her presence still lingered in the house like the scent of her favorite lavender soap. Cora had her mother's green eyes and stubborn chin, but she wondered sometimes if she'd inherited her capacity for lover, if that had died with her at the altar 3 days ago. The heart can be wrong, Papa, she said softly. Mine certainly was about Harold. Samuel snorted. Harold Whitmore ain't worth the powder to blow him up. That boy never had the backbone for frontier life, and he proved it when he ran off to marry that banker's daughter. You're better off without him, though I know that don't make it hurt any less. The mention of her former fiancé sent a familiar twist of pain through Cora's chest. Harold Whitmore had been everything a proper young woman should want: educated, well-dressed, with prospects in his father's banking business. He'd courted her with flowers and poetry, speaking of their future, together with the confidence of a man who'd never faced real hardship. Right up until the moment he'd received a telegram from Denver, informing him that Margaret Crenshaw, daughter of the largest bank owner in Colorado, had accepted his proposal. Apparently, Harold had been hedging his bets, and when the larger prize became available, he'd dropped Cora like a hot stone. The humiliation still burned, but what hurt worse was the realization that she'd never really known him at all. The man she'd thought she loved had been a carefully constructed facade, as false as a theater backdrop. I keep thinking about what you said, Cora continued, staring out the window at the rolling hills that had been her whole world for 24 years. About Mama knowing what her heart needed. But what if the heart can't be trusted? What if it's just another way to fool yourself? Then you'd be throwing away the best part of being human, Samuel said firmly. Your mama didn't marry me because I was the safest choice or the most practical. She married me because when she looked at me, she saw something worth building a life with. That's what real love is, Cora, not the butterflies and poetry, but the willingness to build something together, even when you don't know how it'll turn out. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Cora rose to answer it, expecting to find one of their neighbors or perhaps Dr. Morrison making his rounds. Instead, she found herself face to face with Margaret Henley, the president of the Ladies' Aid Society and the town's unofficial keeper of gossip. Good morning, Cora, dear, Margaret said with the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. I hope I'm not intruding, but I wanted to speak with you about the auction yesterday. Cora's stomach dropped. She'd hoped that her impulsive bid on the mysterious drifter would be forgotten in the excitement of the day's events. Apparently, she'd underestimated the town's appetite for scandal. What about it? Cora asked, though she already knew the answer. Well, it's about the man you acquired, Margaret said, lowering her voice as if speaking of something indecent. Mr. Boone, there's been talk, you understand. Some folks are wondering if it's proper for a young, unmarried woman to have a strange man working her property. He's working for both my father and me, Cora said coolly. Same as any hired hand. Yes, but he's not just any hired hand, is he? Margaret's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of someone about to share particularly juicy gossip. Nobody knows where he came from or why he's here. Some say he's part Indian. Others think he might be running from the law. Cora felt her temper rising. And what do you think, Mrs. Henley? Margaret had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. I think you're a good Christian woman who's been through a terrible ordeal. I think you might not be thinking clearly about the consequences of your actions. My actions? Cora's voice was dangerously quiet. I bid on a man at a charity auction organized by your own society. If there's something improper about that, perhaps you should reconsider the nature of your fundraising events." Samuel's chuckle drifted from the kitchen. "That's my girl," he called out. "Don't let him buffalo you, Cora." Margaret's face flushed red. "I'm only trying to help. The whole town's talking about what happened at the church, and now this. People are starting to wonder if you're not taking leave of your senses." "Let them wonder," Cora said, stepping onto the porch and closing the door behind her. "My senses are just fine, thank you. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." Margaret opened her mouth to say more, then thought better of it. She gathered her skirts and marched down the path with the dignity of someone who'd been gravely insulted. Cora watched her go, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and dread. She'd won this battle, but the war was far from over. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention to the main road. A lone rider was making his way toward the ranch, and even from a distance, Cora could see it was the man himself, Boone. He sat his horse with the easy grace of someone who'd spent most of his life in the saddle, his dark hair catching the morning light. As he drew closer, Cora found herself studying him with new eyes. He was indeed tall, probably 6 feet or more, with the kind of lean, muscled build that spoke of hard work and harder living. His face was weathered by sun and wind, marked by lines that suggested he'd seen more than his share of sorrow. But it was his eyes that caught and held her attention. They were the color of storm clouds, grey and deep, with a sadness that seemed to echo her own. He reined in his horsey, sturdy bay gelding that looked as road-weary as its rider-ran touched the brim of his hat in greeting. "Morning, Miss Bell. I've come to fulfill my obligation." His voice was deeper than she remembered, with the slight rasp of a man who didn't waste words. There was something in his tone that suggested education, though his clothes were those of a common laborer, worn but clean, mended but sturdy. "Mr. Boone," she said formally, though her heart was beating faster than she cared to admit. "I trust you slept well." "Well enough," he replied, dismounting with fluid grace. "I understand you have work that needs doing." Cora looked at him standing there in her yard, this stranger she'd purchased out of defiance and wounded pride, and felt a flutter of panic. What did she really know about him? Margaret Henley's warnings echoed in her mind, mixing with her father's words about the heart, knowing what it needed. "Yes," she said finally. "There's plenty of work. The question is whether you're the man to do it." Something that might have been amusement flickered in his grey eyes. "I reckon there's only one way to find out, Miss Bell. Put me to work." Cora led Boone toward the barn, acutely aware of his presence behind her. His footsteps were surprisingly quiet for such a large man, and when she glanced back, she noticed he moved with the careful economy of someone accustomed to dangerous places. The worn leather gloves on his hands caught her attention. They were quality once, though now they bore the patina of hard use and careful maintenance. "This is what's left of our operation," she said, gesturing toward the collection of weathered buildings that comprise the ranch's heart. "The barn needs mucking, the fence line's down in 3 places, and the well's been acting temperamental. Take your pick." Boone's grey eyes swept the property with the methodical assessment of a man who understood both the value of hard work and the cost of neglect. He paused at the barn door, running his gloved hand along the frame where the wood had begun to split. "Foundation's still solid," he observed quietly. "Rest is just maintenance deferred, nothing that can't be fixed with time and effort." There was something in the way he said it, not judgment, but understanding, that made Cora's defensive walls lower slightly. She'd grown accustomed to the pitying looks of neighbors and the calculating stares of men like Charlie Henderson. Boone's assessment felt different, practical rather than dismissive. "Time we got," she said with bitter humor. "Effort too, I suppose. Money's the scarce commodity around here." Boone nodded, pulling off his gloves and tucking them into his belt. His hands were brown from sun and wind, marked with old scars that spoke of a life lived hard. But they moved with the confident precision of a craftsman as he tested the barn door's hinges. "I'll start with the mucking," he said, "then take a look at that fence line. Well, can wait until I get a better sense of the problem." "You don't have to," Cora began, then stopped herself. Of course he had to. She'd bought his labor for a day, paid good money that the Ladies' Aid Society desperately needed. The fact that her purchase had been motivated by wounded pride and defiance didn't change the transaction. "I'll fetch you some water," she said instead, "and something to eat when you get hungry." Boone paused in the doorway of the barn, his storm-grey eyes meeting hers. "That's kind of you, Miss Bell, but I don't expect special treatment. I'm here to work." Something in his tone made her chest tighten. There was a dignity in his words that reminded her of her father, the pride of a man who understood that honest work was its own reward. She found herself wondering what circumstances had brought him to Dead River, what chain of events had led to him standing on the auction block like a piece of livestock. "It's not special treatment," she said quietly. "It's common courtesy. My mama raised me to feed anyone who works our land." The mention of her mother seemed to soften something in his expression. He touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement. "Your mama sounds like she was a wise woman." She was. Cora felt the familiar ache of loss, but it was gentler now, tempered by the memory of her father's words about the heart, knowing what it needed. "I'll leave you to it then." She turned to go, but his voice stopped her. "Miss Bell, thank you for bidding on me yesterday. I know it wasn't conventional." Cora felt heat rise in her cheeks. The truth was, she wasn't entirely sure why she'd done it. Defiance, certainly. A desire to shock the townspeople who'd been whispering about her humiliation. But there had been something else, something in the way he'd stood there with quiet dignity while other men joked and preened for the bidding women. "You're welcome," she said simply, not trusting herself to say more. She walked back to the house with his words echoing in her mind. The way he'd said conventional suggested a man familiar with social niceties, even if his current circumstances had stripped them away. There were layers to Boone, depths that intrigued her despite her better judgment. Inside, she found her father at the kitchen table, ostensibly reading yesterday's newspaper, but actually watching through the window as Boone disappeared into the barn. "Seems like a capable sort," Samuel observed without looking up from his paper. "It's too early to tell," Cora replied, though she'd been thinking the same thing. "Could be he's all show and no substance." Samuel chuckled. "Could be, but I've been watching men work for more years than you've been alive, daughter. That one moves like he knows what he's about." Cora busied herself preparing a pitcher of water and some bread, trying to ignore the flutter of interest in her chest. The last thing she needed was to develop feelings for another mysterious stranger. Harold had taught her that lesson thoroughly enough. But as the morning wore on, she found herself drawn to the window again and again. Boone worked with the steady rhythm of a man accustomed to physical labor, but there was an intelligence in how he approached each task. He didn't just muck the stall. She examined the barn's structure, testing boards and checking the roof for leaks. When he moved to the fence line, she watched him study the broken posts like a general surveying a battlefield. "Cora Bell, you're moonin' like a schoolgirl," she muttered to herself, turning away from the window with determination. Around noon, she carried the water and food out to where Boone was working on the fence. He'd removed his shirt in the heat, and she tried not to notice the play of muscles across his back as he dug post holes. Scars crisscrossed his torsosome, old and faded, others more recent. Whatever life he'd lived before Dead River, it hadn't been gentle. "Thought you might be thirsty," she said, setting the pitcher and cup on a nearby stump. Boone straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Much obliged." He reached for his shirt, pulling it on with the unconscious modesty of a man unused to being observed while he worked. "You've made good progress," Cora observed, noting that he'd already repaired 2 sections of fence that had been sagging for months. "Wire's good quality," he said, drinking deeply from the cup she'd provided. "Just needed proper tensioning. Whoever built this fence knew what they were doing." "That was my grandfather," Cora said with pride. "He built most of what you see here. Papa always said he had a gift for making things last." Boone nodded, his eyes taking in the careful craftsmanship of the old fence posts. "It shows. Man who builds to last is thinking about more than just himself." "He was thinking about family," Cora said softly, "about leaving something behind that mattered." Good reason to build well, Boone agreed. There was something wistful in his tone that made Cora wonder what he'd left behind, what legacy he carried with him in his wandering. The sound of approaching horses interrupted her thoughts. 3 riders were coming up the main road, moving with the easy confidence of men who owned everything they could see. Charlie Henderson led them, his bulk impressive in the saddle despite his 60-odd years. Behind him rode his son Thomas and their foreman, Jake Morrison, a hard man with cold eyes and a reputation for solving problems with his fists. "Company coming," Boone observed quietly. Something in his tone made Cora look at him sharply. His entire posture had changed, becoming alert and watchful in a way that reminded her of a wolf scenting danger. "Charlie Henderson," she said with resignation. "He owns most of the land around here. Been trying to buy ours for months." Boone's grey eyes assessed the approaching riders with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to judging threats. "Doesn't look like a social call." Charlie Henderson reined in his horse just outside the fence line, his pale eyes taking in the repairs Boone had made before settling on the man himself. "Afternoon, Miss Cora. Heard you acquired yourself some help at yesterday's auction." "Mr. Henderson," Cora replied formally. "Boone, these are my neighbors. Charlie Henderson, his son Thomas, and their foreman Jake Morrison." Boone nodded politely but didn't speak. Cora noticed he'd positioned himself slightly between her and the mounted men, a subtle shift that probably meant nothing but felt protective nonetheless. "Boone," Charlie repeated as if testing the name. "Just Boone? No family name?" "Just Boone," came the quiet reply. There was steel beneath the politeness, a warning that only a fool would ignore. Charlie Henderson had never been accused of being a fool. His eyes narrowed slightly, but he kept his tone conversational. "Funny thing, a man with no past showing up in a place like Dead River makes a body wonder what he might be running from." "Papa," Thomas warned quietly. Even he could sense the tension building in the air. "Just making conversation," Charlie said with false innocence. "Man's got a right to know who's working the neighboring property." Boone set down the water cup with deliberate care, his movements controlled but somehow threatening. "I'm working an honest day for honest pay, nothing more complicated than that." "Course not," Charlie agreed. "Still, if I was Miss Cora, I might want some references before letting a stranger work my land. Never know what kind of trouble might follow a man." The implied threat hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire. Cora felt her temper rise, but before she could speak, Boone stepped forward. "Mr. Henderson," he said quietly, "I appreciate your concern for Miss Bell's welfare, but I think she's capable of making her own decisions about who works her land." The 2 men stared at each other for a long moment, the air crackling with unspoken challenge. Finally, Charlie Henderson smiled, the cold, calculating expression of a predator who'd just identified new prey. "Indeed she is," he said pleasantly. "Come along, boys. We've taken up enough of Miss Cora's time." As the 3 riders moved away, Thomas Henderson looked back with an expression that mixed frustration and something that might have been jealousy. Cora felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "That wasn't about being neighborly," she said when they were out of earshot. "No," Boone agreed quietly. "It wasn't." He returned to his work without another word, but Cora noticed he kept glancing toward the road where the Henderson men had disappeared. Whatever he'd done before coming to Dead River, it had taught him to recognize trouble when he saw it. And Charlie Henderson, she realized with growing certainty, was definitely trouble. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that surprised Cora with its natural ease. Boone arrived each morning just after sunrise, his bay horse picking its way carefully up the rutted path to the ranch house. He never knocked or announced himself, simply set to work on whatever task needed doing most. By the end of the first week, he'd repaired all 3 sections of damaged fence, cleared the debris from the barn roof, and somehow coaxed the temperamental well into producing a steady flow of clean water. It was while watching him work with the animals that Cora first glimpsed the gentleness beneath his weathered exterior. Their old milk cow, Bessie, had been ornery and difficult for months, kicking at anyone who tried to approach her. But when Boone entered her stall, she quieted immediately, allowing him to examine her swollen udder with the careful touch of someone who understood animal pain. "She's got mastitis," he told Cora later, washing his hands in the basin she'd provided. "Infection in the milk ducts. Been bothering her for a while, I'd guess." "Dr. Morrison looked at her last month," Cora said, frustrated. "Said there wasn't much to be done except wait it out." Boone pulled something from his shirt pocket, a small wooden cross, carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift in the lamplight. He turned it over in his hands while he spoke, a gesture that seemed unconscious, but somehow comforting. "There are other ways," he said quietly. "My grandmother knew remedies that most doctors don't learn in their books. Wild herbs, proper care, if you'll trust me to try." The way he hesitated before saying grandmother made Cora wonder about his family, but she pushed the curiosity aside. "What do you need?" "Some things I can find in the hills, others I'll need to buy in town. Won't cost much." "Whatever it takes," Cora said immediately. Bessie was their last cow, their only source of milk and cream. If Boone could heal her, it would be worth far more than his auction price. She watched him pocket the carved cross, noting how his fingers lingered on its surface. There was something reverent in the gesture, a connection to faith that intrigued her. Most of the men she knew wore their religion like Sunday, clothed something to be put on for show, and discarded when inconvenient. Boone's faith seemed different, quieter but more deeply rooted. That afternoon, she found herself walking with him through the hills behind the ranch, ostensibly to help gather the herbs he needed. In truth, she was drawn by curiosity about this quiet man who seemed to know so much about things that should have been foreign to a drifter. "How do you know about animal medicine?" she asked, as they climbed toward a grove of aspen trees, their leaves already turning gold with the approaching autumn. "Picked it up here and there," he replied, but she caught the evasion in his tone. "Spent time with people who understood the old ways." "Indian people?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, colored by the gossip she'd heard in town. Boone paused in his gathering, a handful of some plant she didn't recognize clutched in his weathered fingers. "Some," he said carefully. "Good people mostly. Knew things about healing that white doctors never learned." There was pain in his voice, old and deep, that made Cora regret her question, but before she could apologize, he continued. "My mother was half Cherokee," he said quietly, not looking at her. "Grandmother raised me after she died, taught me about plants, about listening to what the land tells you. Said knowledge like that was too precious to let die." The admission hung between them, like a bridge. Neither was sure they should cross. Cora understood now why some in town whispered about his heritage, why men like Charlie Henderson looked at him with suspicion. In a place like Dead River, being different was often seen as being dangerous. "She sounds like a wise woman," Cora said softly, echoing his words about her own mother. Boone's hands stilled in their work. "She was. Died when I was 15. After that, I was on my own." The loneliness in those words made Cora's chest tighten. She thought of her own mother, gone these many years, and the hollow ache that never quite faded. But at least she'd had her father, had never truly been alone in the world. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw something shift in his grey eyes. "Not your fault. Life happens the way it happens. Can't change it, can only decide how to carry it." They worked in companionable silence after that, gathering the plants Boone needed for Bessie's treatment. Cora found herself studying his profile as he worked, noting the way he moved through the landscape like he belonged there. There was something almost mystical in how he seemed to know exactly where to find what he needed, as if the land itself was guiding him. When they returned to the ranch, Samuel was sitting on the porch, watching their approach with eyes that missed nothing. Over the past week, her father's health had improved noticeably. Whether it was the relief of having competent help around the place or simply the pleasure of watching skilled work being done, he seemed stronger, more like his old self. "Find what you needed?" Samuel called out as they approached. "Yes, sir," Boone replied. "Should have Bessie feeling better in a day or two." "Good to hear." Cora, Mrs. Patterson stopped by while you were gone. Wanted to invite you to Sunday dinner this week. Her nephew's visiting from Denver, apparently. Cora felt her stomach sink. Emma Patterson was a well-meaning widow who'd made it her mission to find suitable husbands for every unmarried woman in the county. The fact that she was suddenly interested in Cora's romantic prospects suggested that news of her purchase at the auction had spread further than she'd hoped. "I'll think about it," Cora said diplomatically, though she had no intention of accepting. The last thing she needed was another awkward introduction to some stranger who would undoubtedly prove as disappointing as Harold Whitmore. Samuel's knowing look suggested he understood her reluctance perfectly. "Course, you're probably too busy around here to go socializing. Lot of work to catch up on." "Indeed there is," Cora agreed gratefully. Boone had listened to this exchange without comment, but she noticed the way his jaw tightened when Samuel mentioned the dinner invitation. Whether it was disapproval of the matchmaking attempt or something else entirely, she couldn't tell. That evening, as Boone prepared to leave for his lodgings in town, Cora found herself reluctant to see him go. The ranch felt more alive with him there, more like the thriving operation it had been in her grandfather's day. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked, though the question was unnecessary. He'd been arriving at the same time every morning since that first day. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, touching the brim of his hat in his customary farewell. "Should know by then if the treatment's working for Bessie." As she watched him ride away, Cora realized that somewhere in the past week, Boone had become more than just hired help. He was becoming part of the rhythm of her days, as essential as sunrise and sunset. The thought should have alarmed her. She'd sworn off romantic entanglements after Harold's betrayal. But what she felt for Boone wasn't the giddy infatuation she'd mistaken for love with her former fiancé. This was something deeper, quieter, built on respect and growing trust, rather than pretty words and false promises. It was the kind of feeling her father had described when he spoke of her mother, not the butterflies and poetry, but the willingness to build something together. The realization both thrilled and terrified her, because she was beginning to suspect that Boone felt it too. Boone's treatment worked exactly as he'd promised. Within 2 days, Bessie was producing rich, sweet milk again. Her temperament improved along with her health. But it was what happened on the 3rd day that truly opened Cora's eyes to the depths of the man she'd purchased at auction. Young Timothy Patterson, Emma's 8-year-old grandson, had been kicked by his family's stallion while trying to impress the older boys. By the time they carried him to the Bell Ranch, the closest place with help, his leg was twisted at an unnatural angle and he was drifting in and out of consciousness. "Dr. Morrison's in Denver for the week," Emma cried as the men laid Timothy on the kitchen table. "We don't know what to do." Cora looked helplessly at the boy's pale face, his breath coming in short, painful gasps. She'd helped with birthing animals and tended minor injuries, but this was beyond her skills. Timothy needed a real doctor, and there wasn't one within 50 miles. That's when Boone stepped forward from where he'd been standing quietly in the doorway. "May I?" he asked, his voice calm despite the urgency of the situation. Emma Patterson looked at him with desperate hope and barely concealed suspicion. "You know about doctrine?" "Some," Boone replied, already moving toward the boy. His hands moved over Timothy's still form with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd dealt with serious injuries before. "Leg's broken, but it's a clean break. Ribs are bruised, but not cracked. Main thing is he's going into shock." From his saddlebags, he produced a worn leather pouchhold and carefully maintained, filled with small bundles of herbs and roots. Cora watched in fascination as he prepared a tea from ingredients she didn't recognize, his movements sure and confident. "This will help with the pain and keep him stable," he explained to Emma, who was hovering anxiously nearby. "But I need to set the leg soon, before the swelling gets worse." "You sure you know what you're doing?" one of the men asked doubtfully. Boone looked up from his work, and for a moment Cora saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before: authority. The kind that came from command rather than request. "I've set bones in places where the nearest doctor was 100 miles away," he said quietly. "But it's your choice. You can wait for Dr. Morrison to return from Denver, or you can trust me to help your boy." Emma Patterson took one look at her grandson's pale face and made her decision. Do it. What followed was one of the most remarkable displays of skill and compassion Cora had ever witnessed. Boone worked with the focused intensity of a surgeon, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he manipulated the broken bone back into alignment. Timothy cried out once, then fell into what appeared to be a natural sleep as the herbal tea took effect. "He'll need to keep the leg still for at least 6 weeks," Boone said, as he secured the makeshift splint he'd fashioned from barnwood and leather strips. "Change the bandages every few days. Keep the wound clean. I can show you how to prepare the tea for pain if it gets bad." Emma Patterson stared at him with tears streaming down her face. "How can I ever thank you?" "No need," Boone replied, already packing away his supplies. "Just take good care of the boy." But word of what he'd done spread through Dead River faster than wildfire. By Sunday, when Cora attended church services, she found herself the center of attention in a way that had nothing to do with her recent humiliation at the altar. "That man you bought at the auction," whispered Sarah Morrison, the blacksmith's wife. "Emma Patterson says he saved young Timothy's life, says he knows more about healing than most real doctors." "Where'd he learn such things?" asked another woman. "Ain't natural for a drifter to know so much." Cora found herself defending Boone without fully understanding why. "He's a good man who helped a child in need. Seems to me that's exactly what we should want in our community." But she could see the wheels turning in their minds, the same suspicion and curiosity that had driven Margaret Henley to her door. A man with Boone's skills didn't end up working day labor unless something had driven him there. The question was what and whether it might bring danger to their quiet town. After the service, Thomas Henderson approached her outside the church, his hat in his hands and his expression earnest. "Miss Cora, I was wondering if I might have a word." She suppressed a sigh. Thomas was a pleasant enough young man, but he had all the depth of a puddle after a light rain. Still, courtesy demanded she listen. "Of course, Mr. Henderson. I've been thinking about what happened at the auction," he said, his face flushing red. "About you buying that drifter. I know you were upset about Mr. Whitmore, and maybe you weren't thinking clearly." Cora felt her temper rise. "I was thinking quite clearly, thank you." "Course you were," he said hastily. "What I mean is, maybe you were thinking about getting back at folks who were talking. I understand that. But now that you've made your point, maybe it's time to consider more permanent arrangements." "What kind of arrangements?" Thomas took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for something momentous. "The kind where you wouldn't have to worry about strange men working your property or what people might say about it. Miss Cora, I'd be honored if you'd consider becoming my wife." The proposal hung in the air between them like a stone waiting to fall. Cora looked at Thomas's earnest face, at the genuine affection in his eyes, and felt nothing but a hollow sadness. Here was everything she should want: security, respectability, a future free from worry about money or reputation, a safe choice that would solve all her practical problems. But when she tried to imagine accepting his offer, all she could think of was the way Boone's eyes had looked when he'd spoken of his grandmother. The gentle reverence in his hands as he'd healed Timothy Patterson, the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from him like heat from a banked fire. "Thomas," she said gently, "you're a good man, and any woman would be fortunate to have your regard. But I can't marry you." His face fell. "Is it because of him? The drifter?" The question caught her off guard, partly because she wasn't sure of the answer herself. "It's because my heart isn't free to give," she said finally, the truth of it surprising her even as she spoke. "Hearts can change," Thomas said desperately, "if you'd just give me a chance." "Thomas." The voice behind them was firm, but not unkind. Cora turned to see Boone approaching, his grey eyes fixed on the younger man with something that might have been sympathy. "The lady's given you her answer. Seems to me a gentleman would respect that." Thomas's face flushed red, but with anger now rather than embarrassment. "I don't recall asking your opinion, Drifter." "No," Boone agreed calmly, "but you're making Miss Bell uncomfortable, and that's something I can't stand by and watch." The two men faced each other in the afternoon sunlight, and Cora could feel the tension crackling between them like lightning before a storm. Thomas was younger and probably stronger, but there was something in Boone's stillness that suggested he was far more dangerous than his quiet demeanor implied. "This isn't over," Thomas said finally, his voice tight with frustration. "Yes," Boone replied quietly, "it is." As Thomas stalked away, Cora found herself alone with Boone outside the church, where her dreams had been shattered just 2 weeks before. But standing there with him, she didn't feel broken anymore. She felt like a woman who was finally beginning to understand the difference between settling for safety and reaching for something real. "Thank you," she said softly. Boone touched the brim of his hat, but his eyes held hers for a long moment. In their grey depths, she saw her own growing feelings reflected back at her, complicated by a sadness she was only beginning to understand. "No thanks needed, Miss Bell. A woman should be free to choose her own path." As they walked back toward where her father waited with the wagon, Cora couldn't help but wonder what path Boone had chosen, and what shadows from his past might be following him down it. It was while they were repairing the corral fence that Cora first saw the medicine pouch. Boone had removed his shirt in the October heat, and there it was, a small leather bag hanging from a braided cord around his neck, decorated with intricate beadwork in blues and whites that seemed to shimmer in the afternoon sun. She tried not to stare, but something about the craftsmanship drew her eye. The beadwork was exquisite, the kind of artistry that spoke of deep cultural tradition and patient hands. When Boone noticed her looking, he didn't try to hide it or tuck it beneath his shirt. Instead, he paused in his work and touched it gently, the way a man might touch a treasured photograph. "My grandmother made it," he said quietly, "before she died, said it would keep me connected to who I was, no matter how far I wandered." "It's beautiful," Cora said, and meant it. "What's inside?" "Sacred things, herbs for healing, a piece of stone from the place I was born, some of her hair." His fingers traced the beadwork reverently, things that matter more than money or land. The admission felt like a gift, another small piece of the puzzle that was Boone. But before Cora could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted them. Jake Morrison, Charlie Henderson's foreman, was riding hard toward the ranch, his face set in grim lines. "Miss Bell," he called out as he reined in his horse, "Charlie wants to see you. Now." Something in his tone made Cora's stomach clench with worry. Jake Morrison wasn't the kind of man who rode social calls, and his presence on her property felt like a threat. "What about?" she asked, though she was already reaching for her coat. "Cattle been going missing from the Henderson spread. Tracks lead this direction." Jake's cold eyes fixed on Boone with unconcealed suspicion. "Charlie thinks your hired hand might know something about it." Boone straightened slowly, his movements controlled but somehow menacing. "I've been working this ranch every day for 2 weeks. Miss Bell can vouch for that." "Can she now?" Jake's smile was ugly. "Funny thing about vouching for a man with no past. Hard to know what you're really standing behind." "That's enough." Cora stepped between the two men, her green eyes flashing with anger. "Mr. Boone has been nothing but honest and hard-working since he arrived. If Charlie Henderson wants to make accusations, he can do it to my face." Jake shrugged, but his hand remained conspicuously close to the gun at his hip. "Suit yourself. But Charlie expects to see both of you within the hour. I'd hate for him to have to come looking." After Jake rode away, Cora found herself shaking with a mixture of rage and fear. The implication was clear. Charlie Henderson was using the missing cattle as an excuse to make trouble for Boone, probably hoping to drive him away from the area. "I should go alone," Boone said quietly, tucking the medicine pouch back beneath his shirt. "This isn't your fight." "Like hell it isn't." The words came out sharper than Cora intended, but she didn't apologize. "You're working my land, which makes you my responsibility. Besides, I know Charlie Henderson. He's all bluster and intimidation until someone stands up to him." Boone studied her face for a long moment, something that might have been admiration flickering in his grey eyes. "You sure about this? Standing with me might cost you more than you realize." "Let me worry about that," Cora replied, though his words sent a chill down her spine. "Right now, we need to figure out what Charlie Henderson is really after." They rode to the Henderson ranch in tense silence, Cora's mare keeping pace with Boone's bay gelding as they covered the 5 miles of rolling prairie between the two properties. The Henderson spread was impressive by any standard, thousands of acres of good grazing land, a ranch house that could have housed 3 families and enough cattle to stock a small town's worth of dinner tables. Charlie Henderson was waiting for them on his front porch, flanked by Jake Morrison and 2 other hired men Cora didn't recognize. The display of force was clearly intended to intimidate, but if Boone felt nervous, he didn't show it. "Miss Cora," Charlie said with false politeness, "good of you to come, and you brought your hired hand. How convenient." "Mr. Henderson," Cora replied coolly, "I understand you've had some cattle go missing. I'm sorry to hear it, but I'm not sure what that has to do with us." Charlie's pale eyes fixed on Boone. "Funny thing about timing, I've been running cattle on this land for 15 years without losing so much as a calf to rustlers. Then this one shows up." He jerked his chin toward Boone, "and suddenly I'm missing 20 head of prime beef." "Coincidence," Boone said quietly, "unless you have evidence suggesting otherwise." "Evidence?" Charlie laughed, but there was no humor in it. "What kind of evidence would a half-breed drifter leave behind? Men like you are too smart for that." The slur hung in the air like a physical blow. Cora felt her temper flare, but before she could speak, Boone stepped forward. "Mr. Henderson," he said, his voice deadly quiet, "I've been working the Bell Ranch every day since I arrived. Miss Bell can verify my whereabouts. If you want to accuse me of something, you'd better have more than suspicion and prejudice to back it up." Charlie's face flushed red. "You watch your tone with me, boy. I've got influence in this county that could make life very difficult for you and anyone fool enough to harbor you." "Is that a threat?" Cora demanded, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "It's a statement of fact," Charlie replied. "Dead River's a small town, Miss Cora. People talk. They're already wondering about your judgment in hiring this man. Wouldn't take much to convince them that you're not thinking clearly since your unfortunate experience with young Whitmore." The reminder of her humiliation at the altar was clearly intended to wound, but instead it only strengthened Cora's resolve. She'd been pushed around enough by men who thought they knew what was best for her. "My judgment is just fine, thank you," she said icily. "And if you're so concerned about rustlers, perhaps you should be looking for actual evidence instead of harassing honest working men." "Honest?" Jake Morrison spoke up from behind his boss. "Funny word to use for a man who won't even give his full name." Boone's hands clenched into fists, but his voice remained level. "My name is my own business. What I do with it is between me and Miss Bell." "And me," came a new voice from the house. Thomas Henderson stepped onto the porch, his young face set in lines of barely controlled anger. "Miss Cora, you can't seriously believe this man is what he seems." "What I believe is that you're all making accusations without proof," Cora replied, "and I'm getting tired of it." Charlie Henderson studied her for a long moment, his calculating eyes moving between her and Boone. "Very well. But mark my words, Miss Cora, when trouble comes calling, and it will, don't say I didn't warn you." As they rode back to the Bell Ranch, Cora found herself glancing frequently at Boone's profile. His jaw was set in granite lines, and she could see the tension radiating from his shoulders like heat from a forge. "They're going to keep pushing," she said finally. "I know," he replied quietly. "Question is whether you're prepared for what that might mean." Cora thought about her ranch, her father, the life she'd built in Dead River. Then she looked at the man riding beside her, proud, gentle, carrying secrets that might destroy them both, and knew that whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. "We'll handle it together," she said firmly, "whatever it takes." Boone's grey eyes met hers, and in them she saw something that made her breath catch not just gratitude, but something deeper and more dangerous, something that felt remarkably like love. That evening, as the amber light of sunset painted the ranch in shades of gold and crimson, Cora found herself sitting on the porch with her father. the silver locket that had belonged to her mother warm in her palm. The locket had been a constant companion since childhood, a tangible connection to the woman who'd given her life and died, bringing her into the world. "You're thinking hard about something," Samuel observed, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. "About Mama," Cora admitted, opening the locket to reveal the tiny daguerreotype inside. Her mother's face looked back at her young, hopeful, with the same green eyes and stubborn chin that Cora saw in her own mirror. "About what she would have done in my place." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, watching Boone tend to his horse near the barn. "Your mama was the bravest woman I ever knew. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because she did what was right even when it scared her half to death. Were you afraid when you married her, knowing what people would say about a poor rancher courting the banker's daughter?" "Terrified," Samuel admitted with a chuckle. "Her father threatened to disown her if she went through with it, said I was beneath her station, that I'd never amount to anything more than a dirt farmer." Cora had heard fragments of this story before, but never the complete truth. "What changed his mind?" "He saw how your mama looked at me, saw that she'd rather be poor and happy than rich and miserable. Sometimes love is the only proof you need that a choice is right." Before Cora could respond, Boone appeared at the bottom of the porch steps, his hat in his hands and his expression carefully neutral. "Miss Bell, Mr. Bell," he said formally, "I wanted to speak with you both before I head back to town." "Course you did," Samuel said, settling back in his chair with the satisfaction of a man who'd been expecting this conversation. "Pull up a chair, son. Time we had ourselves a proper talk." Boone hesitated, clearly surprised by the invitation. "Sir, I don't want to impose." "Sit," Samuel commanded with the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "And stop calling me sir. Makes me feel older than dirt." Cora watched as Boone lowered himself into the third chair, his large frame somehow making the simple wooden seat look fragile. In the fading light, she could see the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the weight of whatever burdens he carried. "I owe you both an explanation," he said quietly, "about who I am, where I come from. After what happened today with Henderson, you deserve to know what you're getting mixed up in." "Only if you want to tell us," Cora said quickly. "We're not asking for your secrets." Boone's grey eyes found hers in the twilight. Maybe it's time someone knew them. He was quiet for so long that Cora began to think he'd changed his mind. Then, slowly, he began to speak. "My name is Boone Mackenzie. I was born in the Cherokee Nation, in what's now called Oklahoma. My mother was half Cherokee, half Irish. My father was a cavalry officer stationed at Fort Gibson." The words came haltingly at first, like water from a reluctant well, then with increasing fluency as the story took hold. "My father died when I was 12, cholera epidemic that swept through the fort. After that, it was just me and my grandmother. She raised me in the old ways, taught me about the land, about healing, about respecting the spirits that live in all growing things." Cora found herself leaning forward, caught up in the quiet cadence of his voice. There was pain in his words, but also deep love for the woman who'd shaped him. "What happened to her?" Samuel asked gently. "She died when I was 15. After that, I had nowhere to go, no family left. The Indian agent tried to send me to a government school, but I ran instead. Spent the next few years drifting, taking work where I could find it." "How'd you end up in the army?" Samuel's question was shrewd, based on observations Cora hadn't even realized he'd made. Boone's smile was rueful. "You don't miss much, do you? I enlisted when I was 18, figured it was better than starving, and I knew something about horses and tracking from my grandmother. Turned out I had a talent for soldiering." "What kind of talent?" Cora asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know. "The kind that gets you promoted fast and sent places other men don't come back from." His voice was matter-of-fact, but she could hear the weight of memory beneath the words. "I made sergeant, then lieutenant. Spent 10 years fighting Indians who were just trying to protect their land, following orders that made me sick to my stomach. The irony wasn't lost on any of them, a man with Cherokee blood, fighting his own people in service to the government that had displaced them. "Why'd you leave?" Samuel asked. Boone was quiet for a long moment, his hands working the brim of his hat like worry beads. "There was an incident. A village that was supposed to be hostile turned out to be mostly women and children. My commanding officer ordered an attack anyway. I refused." The simple words carried the weight of a man's entire world collapsing. Cora could imagine the choice he'd faced: follow an immoral order or face court-martial for insubordination. "They branded you a deserter," Samuel said. "It wasn't a question. Among other things, put a price on my head, spread word that I'd gone native, turned traitor, made it impossible for me to stay anywhere long enough to put down roots." "How long ago?" Cora's voice was barely above a whisper. 3 years. I've been moving ever since, taking work where I can find it, trying to stay ahead of bounty hunters and anyone else looking to collect on that price." The revelation hung in the air between them like smoke from a distant fire. Cora understood now why he'd been so careful with his words, why he'd seemed ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble. He wasn't just a drifter, he was a fugitive, a man running from a past that would never stop chasing him. "That's why Henderson's making trouble," Samuel said thoughtfully. "He suspects something, maybe heard rumors." "Maybe," Boone agreed. "Or maybe he just doesn't like the idea of his son losing interest in Miss Bell because of me." The admission sent heat racing through Cora's veins. So he had noticed Thomas's attention, had understood the dynamics at play better than she'd realized. "Thomas Henderson's interest is his own business," she said firmly, "and it has nothing to do with my decisions." Boone's eyes met hers across the small space between their chairs. "And what are your decisions, Miss Bell?" The question hung in the twilight air, loaded with meaning that went far beyond simple employment arrangements. Cora felt the weight of the moment, the sense that whatever she said next would change everything between them. She thought of her mother's photograph in the locket, of her father's words about love being the only proof needed. She thought of the gentle way Boone worked with animals, the skill he'd shown healing Timothy Patterson, the quiet dignity with which he carried his pain. "My decision," she said quietly, "is that the past doesn't matter as much as what a man does with his present." Something shifted in Boone's expression, hope warring with disbelief. "Even if that past might bring trouble to your door." "Trouble has a way of finding us regardless," Samuel interjected with the wisdom of his years. "Least this way, we'll face it with good help." Boone looked between them, these two people who barely knew him, but were willing to stand with him against whatever storm might come. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I don't deserve your trust." "Trust isn't about deserving," Cora said softly. "It's about choosing to believe in someone despite the risks." As the last light faded from the western sky, the three of them sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, and the ever-present threat of Boone's past catching up with him. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, Boone Mackenzie wasn't running anymore. 3 days after Boone's revelation, Cora was hanging laundry when she spotted the rider approaching from town. Even from a distance, she could tell it was Ezra Sullivan, the postmaster, his distinctive hunched posture unmistakable in the saddle. But it was the urgency of his approach that made her stomach clench with worry. Ezra never hurried unless the news was important. "Miss Bell," he called out as he reined in his horse near the clothesline. "Got a letter for you. Come all the way from Denver," marked urgent. Cora wiped her hands on her apron before accepting the envelope. The paper was expensive, cream-colored with her name written in the familiar copperplate script she'd once thought elegant. Her heart sank as she recognized Harold Whitmore's handwriting. "Thank you, Ezra," she managed, though her voice sounded strange to her own ears. "Hope it ain't bad news," the postmaster said, tipping his hat before riding back toward town. Cora stood in her yard, holding the letter like it might burst into flames. She'd thought herself past caring about anything Harold might have to say, but the sight of his handwriting brought back a flood of memory, some sweet, most bitter. "Cora?" Her father's voice came from the porch. "Everything all right?" "Just a letter from Denver," she replied, not ready to explain further. She found herself walking toward the barn where Boone was repairing a harness, the letter still unopened in her hands. Something about his presence had become comforting, a steady anchor in whatever storms might come. "Harold?" he asked quietly, glancing at the envelope without seeming to pry. "Yes." She sank onto a hay bale, staring at the letter. "I'm not sure I want to know what he has to say. Want me to leave you alone to read it?" The offer was made with typical consideration, but Cora found herself shaking her head. "No. I think whatever this says, I'd rather not face it alone." Boone set down the harness and gave her his full attention, his grey eyes steady and reassuring. Taking a deep breath, Cora broke the wax seal and unfolded the letter. The words seemed to blur together at first, then snapped into sharp focus as their meaning became clear. "My dearest Cora, I write this letter with a heart full of regret and a soul tormented by the magnitude of my mistake. The marriage to Margaret Crenshaw has been called off her father, discovered certain irregularities in my family's financial situation that made the union impossible. But more than that, I've come to realize that in my pursuit of advancement, I lost sight of what truly mattered. You, Cora. Your goodness, your strength, your capacity for love, that I was too blind to appreciate. I am returning to Dead River to beg your forgiveness and, if you'll have me, your hand in marriage once again. I know I have no right to ask, but I pray that your generous heart might find room for redemption. I arrive tomorrow on the afternoon stage, ready to prove that I am the man you deserved all along. Your devoted Harold." The letter fluttered from Cora's nerveless fingers to land in the hay at her feet. For a moment, she couldn't breathe, couldn't think beyond the surreal notion that Harold was coming back, that he thought he could simply waltz back into her life and pick up where they'd left off. "What does he want?" Boone asked quietly. "To marry me," Cora said, her voice hollow with shock. "His engagement to the banker's daughter fell through, so now he wants me back." Boone's jaw tightened, but his voice remained carefully neutral. "What do you want?" "I want—" Cora started, then stopped. What did she want? 3 weeks ago, she would have given anything to have Harold return, to have her humiliation transformed into vindication. But now the thought of his return filled her with nothing but dread. Before she could answer, the sound of multiple horses approaching interrupted her thoughts. Through the barn door, she could see a group of riders at least 6 men, moving with the purposeful formation that spoke of military training or law enforcement. Boone had gone very still beside her, his entire body tense as a coiled spring. "Cora," he said quietly, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. Those men there are not here for social calls." Something in his tone made her blood run cold. "How do you know?" "Because I recognize the lead rider." His voice was grim with acceptance. "Captain Morrison, my former commanding officer, the one who ordered the attack on that village." Cora's heart hammered against her ribs as understanding crashed over her. "They're here for you." "Yes, and they won't much care who gets hurt in the process of taking me back." The riders had reached the yard now, spreading out in a loose semicircle that effectively blocked any escape routes. Captain Morrison was exactly what Cora would have expected from Boone's description. Tall, lean man with cold blue eyes and the kind of mustache favored by career soldiers. His uniform was immaculate despite the dust of travel, and he wore his authority like a well-fitted coat. "Sergeant Mackenzie," he called out, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "Or should I say, former Sergeant Mackenzie, you've led us quite a chase." Boone stepped out of the barn, his hands carefully visible and empty. "Captain Morrison, can't say I'm surprised to see you, though I am curious how you found me." "Anonymous tip," Morrison replied with a cold smile. "Seems someone in this area recognized you from the wanted posters, very public-spirited of them." Cora felt sick. Someone in Dead River had betrayed Boone, had sent word to the authorities about his whereabouts. She thought immediately of Charlie Henderson, of the threats he'd made just days before. "Captain Morrison," she said, stepping out of the barn to stand beside Boone. "I'm Cora Bell. This is my property, and Mr. Mackenzie is my employee." If you have business with him, I'd appreciate knowing what it's about." Morrison's cold eyes assessed her with the calculation of a man sizing up an obstacle. "Miss Bell, I'm here to arrest a deserter and traitor. I'd advise you not to interfere." "Deserter?" Cora's voice sharpened with indignation. "For refusing to murder innocent women and children?" "For disobeying a direct order in time of war," Morrison corrected smoothly. "Though I'm curious where you heard such a creative version of events." The wanted poster he pulled from his jacket was yellowed with age but still clear enough to read. The description matched Boone perfectly, down to the scar on his left hand and the Cherokee features inherited from his mother. But it was the charges listed that made Cora's blood boil: desertion, treason, conspiracy with hostile Indians. "These charges are lies," she said flatly. "Are they?" Morrison's smile never wavered. "Or perhaps you've been taken in by the sob story of a man desperate to avoid justice. Tell me, Miss Bell, did he mention the military payroll that went missing the same night he disappeared? $5,000 in gold that would buy a man a lot of sympathy and false papers." Cora felt the ground shift beneath her feet. This was a new accusation, one that Boone hadn't mentioned in his confession. She turned to look at him, searching his face for denial, for explanation, for anything that might refute this fresh horror. But Boone's expression was that of a man who just watched his last hope die. "The payroll," he said quietly, "was stolen by my commanding officer's nephew, Lieutenant Morrison, your brother, Captain. I saw him take it, tried to report it through proper channels. That's when the village massacre became convenient." The family resemblance was obvious now that Cora knew to look for it, the same cold blue eyes, the same aristocratic nose, the same ruthless calculation that put advancement above honor. "A desperate lie from a desperate man," Morrison said. But Cora caught the flicker of something in his eyes. Not surprised knowledge. "James died heroically in an Indian attack 2 days after the incident. Hardly the action of a thief. James died because you couldn't risk him talking," Boone replied steadily. "Just like you can't risk me talking. This isn't about justice, Morrison. This is about covering up your family's crimes." The truth hung in the air between them like smoke from a powder charge. Cora understood now why Boone had been running, why the charges against him were so serious. He wasn't just a deserter, he was a witness to corruption and murder. A man who could destroy the career of his former commanding officer with a few words of testimony. "Enough," Morrison snapped, his facade of military courtesy finally cracking. "Sergeant Mackenzie, you're under arrest for desertion, treason, and theft of military property. Surrender now, and I'll make sure your trial is conducted with proper military honor." "And if I don't surrender?" Morrison's hand moved to rest on his sidearm. "Then I'll be forced to bring you back dead rather than alive. Your choice." Cora stepped closer to Boone, her decision made with the clarity that comes in moments of crisis. "He's not going anywhere with you." "Miss Bell," Morrison said with false patience, "you're interfering with military justice. I could have you arrested as an accessory." "Then arrest me," she replied, lifting her chin with the same stubborn pride that had sustained 3 generations of Bell women. "But you'll have to go through me to get to him." Morrison's eyes narrowed as he assessed this new complication. A dead civilian, especially a woman, would be much harder to explain than a dead deserter. But before he could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "I wouldn't advise that, Captain." Samuel Bell stood on the porch, his old army rifle cradled in his arms, with the easy familiarity of a man who'd used it in anger before. Behind him, Cora could see other figures, neighbors who'd heard the commotion and come to investigate, their own weapons visible. "This is Belland," Samuel continued, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd spent his life defending what was his. "And we don't take kindly to bullies, whether they wear uniforms or not." Morrison looked around at the gathering crowd, calculating odds that were no longer in his favor. But his smile never wavered. "Very well," he said finally. "But this isn't over, Mackenzie. I'll be back with proper warrants and enough men to make resistance futile. Enjoy your temporary reprieve." As the soldiers rode away, Cora felt Boone's hand close over hers, warm, calloused, trembling slightly with the aftermath of adrenaline. "Thank you," he said quietly, "but you've just made yourself a target. Morrison won't forget this." "Let him come," Cora replied, surprising herself with the fierceness in her voice. "We'll be ready." But even as she spoke the brave words, she couldn't shake the feeling that the storm they'd just weathered was nothing compared to what was coming. The late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the Bell Ranch when Harold Whitmore arrived on the stage from Denver, just as his letter had promised. Cora watched from the kitchen window as the familiar figure climbed down from the dusty coach, his city clothes and pale complexion marking him as clearly out of place in Dead River as a peacock among prairie chickens. Her father's shotgun leaned against the wall beside the door, cleaned, loaded, and ready for whatever trouble Captain Morrison might bring when he returned. The irony wasn't lost on her that Harold was arriving at perhaps the most dangerous moment in her life, expecting to find the same naive woman he'd abandoned at the altar. "You don't have to see him," Boone said quietly from where he sat at the kitchen table, methodically checking the ammunition for his own rifle. Over the past day, he'd transformed from a gentle ranch hand into something harder, more dangerous a soldier, preparing for war. "Yes, I do," Cora replied, watching Harold adjust his cufflinks as he approached the house. "He came all this way. The least I can do is tell him to his face that he's wasted his time." Samuel looked up from where he was cleaning his old army colt. "Want me to do it for you? Might save some unpleasantness." "No, Papa. This is something I need to handle myself." The knock came precisely when she expected it, 3 measured raps that spoke of Harold's unfailing sense of propriety. Cora smoothed her skirts and opened the door to find her former fiancé standing on the porch, hat in hand, and wearing the kind of confident smile that had once made her heart flutter. "Cora," he said warmly, as if 3 weeks of humiliation and heartbreak had never happened, "you look wonderful. Country life agrees with you." He was still handsome, she noticed with detached observation, still possessed of the refined features and careful grooming that had initially attracted her. But looking at him now, she wondered how she'd ever thought his polished exterior concealed any real substance. "Harold," she replied coolly, "you look exactly the same." If he heard the lack of warmth in her greeting, he gave no sign. "I got your letter." "I didn't send you a letter. I meant to say, I hope you received mine. I know my request must come as a surprise, but I've done a great deal of thinking since our unfortunate misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" Cora's voice sharpened. "Is that what you call abandoning me at the altar for a richer woman?" Harold had the grace to look embarrassed. "That was poorly handled, I admit. But surely you can understand that a man in my position must consider practical matters when choosing a wife. The Crenshaw alliance would have opened doors for both our families. And now that it's fallen through, you've decided I'll do as a consolation prize." "Cora, please." Harold stepped closer, his voice taking on the cajoling tone she remembered too well. "I know I hurt you, but I'm here to make amends. We could have a good life together, comfortable, respectable. I have prospects in Denver now, real opportunities that could give us everything we dreamed of." Through the open door behind her, Cora could hear the quiet sounds of Boone and her father preparing for whatever siege might come. The contrast between Harold's talk of comfort and respectability and the very real danger facing the people she'd come to love was stark. "What we dreamed of," she repeated. "I don't think you ever asked what I dreamed of, Harold. You just assumed I'd be content to be a pretty ornament in whatever life you chose to build." For the first time, Harold seemed to register that this conversation wasn't going according to his plan. "I don't understand. 3 weeks ago, you would have been grateful for a second chance. 3 weeks ago, I thought love meant accepting whatever scraps of affection a man chose to throw my way," Cora replied. "I've learned better since then." "From who?" Harold's eyes narrowed, and she saw a flash of the calculating nature that had driven him to betray her in the first place. "I heard talk in town about some drifter you've hired. Surely you're not throwing away our future for a common laborer." The dismissive tone in his voice when he spoke of Boone made Cora's temper flare. "That common laborer has more honor in his little finger than you have in your entire body." Honor doesn't pay bills or provide security. Harold snapped, his polished facade finally cracking. What can he offer you except uncertainty and scandal? Do you really want to spend your life worrying about where your next meal is coming from? I'd rather worry about meals with a good man than feast at the table of a coward, Cora shot back. Harold's face flushed red. A coward? I'll have you know I've built a respectable career through careful planning and advantageous connections. That's not cowardice, that's intelligence. It's cowardice when it means abandoning people who trust you the moment something better comes along. Cora replied steadily. It's cowardice when it means choosing safety over what's right. And what's right? Harboring a wanted fugitive. The words hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Cora felt her blood turn to ice as she realized Harold knew about Boone's situation, and more importantly, how he'd come by that knowledge. You, she breathed. You're the one who told Captain Morrison where to find him. Harold straightened, apparently deciding that subtlety was no longer serving his purpose. I made some inquiries when I heard about your association with this man. Turned out the army's been looking for him for quite some time. I thought it was my civic duty to report his whereabouts. Your civic duty? Cora's voice was deadly quiet. Or your jealousy? Does it matter? The point is, this man is a dangerous criminal who's taken advantage of your isolation and grief. I'm offering you a way out before you're completely ruined by association with him. Behind her, Cora heard the scrape of a chair and the soft sound of booted feet crossing the kitchen floor. Boone appeared in the doorway, his grey eyes fixed on Harold, with an expression that made the smaller man take an involuntary step backward. "Mr. Whitmore," Boone said quietly, "I don't believe we've been properly introduced." Harold's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. "I know who you are. The whole town knows by now." "Then you know I'm not a man who takes kindly to threats against people I care about." Boone's voice was conversational, but there was steel beneath the words. "And you know that betraying me to Morrison put Miss Bell in danger. I was trying to protect her." "You were trying to eliminate competition," Boone corrected. "Just like you always do when something threatens your comfortable little world." Samuel appeared beside Boone, his shotgun cradled casually in his arms. "Harold," he said with deceptive mildness, "I think it's time you headed back to town. Afternoon stage won't wait, and I hear Denver's real nice this time of year." Harold looked between the three of them, Cora with her chin raised in defiance, Boone radiating quiet menace, and Samuel with his shotgun, and apparently decided that discretion was indeed the better part of valor. "This isn't over, Cora," he said, backing toward his horse. "When the army comes back for him, when you're arrested as an accessory, don't say I didn't try to save you." "Harold," Cora called out as he reached his horse. He turned back with obvious hope that she'd changed her mind. "Don't ever come back here. If you do, I'll let Boone handle the conversation." As Harold rode away toward town, probably to catch the evening stage back to Denver, Cora felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She'd finally closed the door on that chapter of her life, and it felt like emerging from a dark room into sunlight. "Feel better?" her father asked with a knowing smile. "Much," she admitted, "though his visit does complicate things. If Morrison was planning to come back anyway, now he'll know exactly what kind of resistance to expect." Boone nodded grimly. "He'll bring more men this time, probably some locals who think they're doing their patriotic duty. We need to be ready." "What do you suggest?" Samuel asked. "First, we need to know when they're coming. Do you have anyone in town you can trust to watch for soldiers?" "Emma Patterson," Cora said immediately. "Timothy's grandmother. After what you did for her grandson, she'd do anything for us." "Good. Send word to her to watch for military arrivals and let us know immediately." Boone was thinking like a soldier now, his strategic mind working through possibilities. "Second, we need to prepare defensible positions. This house is too exposed, but the barn has good sightlines and thick walls." "You're talking about a siege," Samuel observed. "I'm talking about survival," Boone replied. "Morrison's not going to give up easily, and he's not going to be particular about who gets hurt in the process." That evening, as they worked to prepare their defenses, moving supplies to the barn and checking ammunition, Cora found herself alone with Boone near the corral. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the promise of winter. "There's still time for you to leave," she said quietly. "You could be miles away before morning." Boone paused in his work, his hands resting on the fence rail as he looked out over the land that had become home to him over the past weeks. "And go where? I've been running for 3 years, Cora. I'm tired of it, even if staying means dying." He turned to face her, his grey eyes reflecting the last light of sunset. "Especially then, I'd rather die fighting for something I believe in than live as a coward running from my past." "And what do you believe in?" "You," he said simply. "This place. The idea that sometimes good people have to stand up to bullies, even when the odds are against them." Cora felt her heart swell with emotion, too powerful for words. Instead, she stepped closer and took his hands in hers, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of his hard life. "Then we fight," she said firmly. "Whatever comes, we face it together." As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed across the prairie. But this wasn't the measured approach of soldiers. This was someone riding hard, with news that couldn't wait. Emma Patterson's grandson, Timothy, reined in his horse at the gate, his young face flushed with excitement and fear. "Miss Cora," he called out, "Grandma sent me to tell you there's a whole company of soldiers camped outside town. They're planning to ride out at first light." Boone and Cora exchanged glances across the twilight. The storm they'd been preparing for was about to break, and with it would come the test of everything they'd built together. "Thank you, Timothy," Cora said calmly. "Ride home safe now, and tell your grandmother we're grateful." As the boy rode away into the gathering darkness, Boone checked his rifle one final time. "Ready?" he asked. Cora thought of her mother's locket, of her father's words about the heart knowing what it needed, of the choice between safety and love that had brought her to this moment. "Ready," she replied, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Dawn came grey and cold, the autumn sky heavy, with clouds that promised rain before nightfall. From her position in the barn loft, Cora could see the dust cloud long before the riders became visibler, company of cavalry soldiers approaching in formation, their sabers catching what little sunlight penetrated the overcast sky. Boone crouched beside her, his own cavalry saber laid across his knees like a talisman from another life. He'd retrieved it from his saddlebags the night before, the blade still sharp despite years of disuse. The weapon seemed to transform him, bringing out the soldier he'd tried so hard to leave behind. 30 men, he murmured, counting the approaching figures with professional precision. "More than I expected. Morrison's taking this seriously." "Maybe he's just trying to intimidate us," Cora suggested, though she didn't believe it herself. "No, look at how they're deployed." Boone pointed to the flanking movements already beginning. "He's planning a full assault. No quarter asked, none given." Below them in the barn, Samuel Bell checked his ammunition one final time. At 73, he moved with the careful deliberation of age, but his hands were steady and his eyes clear. This wasn't the first time he'd faced overwhelming odds, and his calm presence was a comfort to them all. Captain Morrison's voice carried clearly across the morning air as the soldiers took their positions. "Sergeant Mackenzie, this is your final chance to surrender peacefully. Come out with your hands visible, and no harm will come to the civilians." Boone's laugh was bitter. "He's lying, of course. Can't afford to leave witnesses to what really happened back at Fort Gibson." "Mackenzie," Morrison called again, "I'm giving you 1 minute to consider your options." Instead of answering, Boone stood slowly, his saber gleaming in his hand, as he moved to the barn's main entrance. The sight of him, tall, proud, every inch the soldier he'd once been, seemed to electrify the assembled cavalry. "Captain Morrison," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd once commanded respect, "I have a counter-proposal. Single combat, officer to officer, your honor against mine." A murmur ran through the ranks of soldiers. Several looked uncertain now, perhaps wondering for the first time if they were on the right side of this conflict. Morrison's face flushed red. "You're in no position to make demands, deserter. Afraid to face me blade to blade?" Boone's taunt was calculated, designed to wound Morrison's pride. "Or do you only fight women and children these days?" The words hit their mark. Morrison's hand moved to his own saber, and for a moment Cora thought he might actually accept the challenge. Then his expression hardened with renewed resolve. "You always were too clever for your own good, Mackenzie. But I didn't come here to play games." He turned to his men. "Take the barn. Kill anyone who resists." The attack came with the practiced efficiency of professional soldiers. Half the company dismounted and advanced in a skirmish line, while the others provided covering fire from horseback. But they were advancing against opponents who knew the ground and had prepared accordingly. Samuel's shotgun boomed from the barn's side window, and one of the advancing soldiers stumbled and fell. Cora, positioned in the loft with her father's hunting rifle, picked her targets carefully, aiming for legs and shoulders rather than kill shots. These were soldiers following orders, not evil men. But Boone showed no such restraint. His rifle cracked with deadly precision, and cavalry troopers began dropping with the mechanical regularity of a man who'd spent years perfecting the art of warfare. Each shot was a reminder of the skills that had made him valuable to the army, skills now turned against his former comrades. "Flank left," Morrison shouted, trying to coordinate his men's advance. "Get around behind them." But the flanking movement ran straight into Samuel Bell's carefully prepared surprises. The old rancher had spent the night stringing wire and digging shallow pits, creating obstacles that turned the soldiers' disciplined advance into a confused scramble. A young lieutenant barely, old enough to shave, made it through the obstacles and reached the barn door. He burst through with his pistol drawn, only to find himself face to face with Boone Mackenzie and 3 feet of razor-sharp steel. "Lieutenant," Boone said quietly, his saber point resting against the young man's throat, "I suggest you reconsider your life choices." The lieutenant's pistol clattered to the ground as his hands shook with terror. "Please, I have a wife, children." "Then go home to them," Boone replied, stepping aside to let the man flee. "This isn't your fight." The lieutenant needed no further encouragement. He bolted from the barn and ran for his horse, ignoring Morrison's shouted commands to return to the fight. His example proved contagious. Other soldiers began to waver, their enthusiasm for the battle cooling as they realized they were attacking civilians who'd done nothing but offer shelter to a man fleeing injustice. "Hold your positions," Morrison screamed, his careful plan disintegrating into chaos. "That's an order." But discipline was breaking down, and several more soldiers began withdrawing from their positions. The tide of battle was turning, and Morrison knew it. That's when he made his fatal mistake. In his desperation to salvage the situation, Morrison grabbed a fallen soldier's rifle and aimed it directly at Cora, visible in the barn loft window. "Surrender now, Mackenzie, or the woman dies." The threat hung in the morning air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Every gun fell silent as both sides recognized the moment for what it was, the point where civilized warfare crossed into something darker and more desperate. Boone's grey eyes met Cora's across the space between them, and in that look she saw not fear, but fury. Cold, calculating, absolutely lethal fury. Captain Morrison had just made the last mistake of his military career. Time seemed suspended in that moment, between Morrison's threat and whatever would follow. Cora could see the rifle barrel pointed at her chest, could read the desperation in the captain's pale eyes. But instead of fear, she felt a strange calm settle over her, the peace that comes when you realize you're exactly where you're supposed to be, facing exactly what you're meant to face. "Captain," Boone said quietly, his voice cutting through the morning air with surgical precision, "you have 5 seconds to lower that weapon before I show you what I learned in those places you sent me." Morrison's laugh was wild, unhinged. "You're in no position to make threats, Sergeant. Drop your weapons, all of you, or I'll." He never finished the sentence. Boone moved with the fluid grace of a man born to warfare, his cavalry saber leaving its sheath in a motion too quick for the eye to follow. The blade caught Morrison's rifle barrel, deflecting it skyward, just as the captain's finger tightened on the trigger. The shot went harmlessly into the cloudy sky, and before Morrison could recover, 3 feet of Damascus steel was resting against his throat. "You were saying?" Boone inquired politely. The remaining soldiers froze, caught between their duty to rescue their commanding officer and their growing certainty that they were on the wrong side of this fight. Several had lowered their weapons entirely, their faces reflecting the confusion of men who'd been told they were pursuing a dangerous criminal, only to find themselves attacking a ranch defended by an old man, a woman, and the most competent soldier any of them had ever seen. Morrison's face had gone white, but his eyes still burned with fanatic conviction. "You can't win this, Mackenzie. Even if you kill me, they'll send more. You'll never be free." "Maybe not," Boone agreed conversationally, "but you won't be around to see it." From her position in the loft, Cora could see what the others couldn't: more riders approaching from the direction of town. For a moment her heart sank, thinking Morrison had called for reinforcements. Then she recognized the lead rider and felt hope surge through her like electricity. "Boone," she called softly, "look toward town." Sheriff Jake Wilson was riding hard toward the ranch, followed by what appeared to be half the male population of Dead River. Even from a distance, Cora could see the grim determination on their faces. These weren't men coming to help arrest Boone. These were neighbors coming to defend one of their own. Morrison saw them too, and his face crumpled as he realized his carefully planned operation was falling apart. "Civilians," he spat. "They don't understand what's at stake here." "What's at stake," said a new voice from the barn door, "is the difference between justice and vengeance." Everyone turned to see Thomas Henderson standing in the doorway, his young face set in lines of mature resolve. Behind him stood his father, Charlie, looking older and more tired than Cora had ever seen him. "Tom?" Morrison's voice cracked with disbelief. "What are you doing here?" "Setting things right," Thomas replied firmly. "Tell them, Pa. Tell them what you told me." Charlie Henderson stepped forward, his hat in his hands and his eyes fixed on the ground. "Captain, I owe you an apology and an explanation." Morrison's confusion was evident. "What are you talking about?" "The cattle rustling, the missing stock I blamed on Mr. Boone." Charlie's voice was heavy with shame. "It was my own men, working with Jake Morrison, your brother. I found the evidence hidden in our line shack yesterday." The revelation hit the assembled soldiers like a physical blow. Cora saw understanding dawn on several faces as the pieces of Morrison's deception finally fell into place. "You're lying," Morrison snarled, but his protest lacked conviction. "I wish I were," Charlie replied sadly. "Your brother was stealing from me for months, using the money to pay gambling debts in Denver. When Mr. Boone started asking questions, started poking around places he shouldn't, Jake got nervous, sent word to you about a wanted deserter who might cause trouble." Sheriff Wilson and his posse had reached the ranch now, their horses surrounding Morrison's remaining soldiers. The sheriff himself dismounted and walked calmly toward the barn, his badge gleaming on his vest. "Captain Morrison," he said formally, "I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of conspiracy, fraud, and abuse of military authority." Morrison's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, rage, and finally resignation. "You can't arrest a United States Army officer." "I can arrest a civilian who's been masquerading as one," Wilson replied calmly. "Judge Parker in Denver's been investigating your activities for months. Turns out desertion charges are a lot easier to file when you forge the paperwork yourself." The truth hit Cora like a physical blow. Morrison had never been acting under official orders. He'd been pursuing Boone for personal reasons, using forged documents and his own men to hunt down the one witness who could destroy him. "The real army's been looking for you, Captain," Wilson continued. "Something about missing payrolls and falsified reports. They're very interested in having a conversation with you." Boone slowly lowered his saber, stepping back to let Wilson and his men take Morrison into custody. The disgraced captain offered no resistance, his shoulders slumped in defeat. As the sheriff's men led Morrison away, his remaining soldiers gathered uncertainly in the yard. Without their captain's authority, they seemed lost, unsure of their next move. "Sergeant Mackenzie," One of them called out a grizzled veteran who bore the stripes of a master sergeant. "What are your orders, sir?" Boone looked at the man with something that might have been amusement. "I'm not your commanding officer, Sergeant. Haven't been for 3 years." "Maybe not officially," the veteran replied. "But you're the only real soldier here. Tell us what to do." Boone considered this for a long moment, then pulled the engagement ring from his pocket, the simple gold band that Cora had worn so briefly, then given to him as a symbol of her choice between safety and love. "Go home," he said finally. "All of you. This war is over." As the soldiers began to disperse, Cora climbed down from the loft and walked to where Boone stood in the morning sunlight. The ring glittered in his palm, like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. "Is it really over?" she asked softly. "This part is," he replied, then dropped to one knee and held out the ring. "But I'm hoping the next part is just beginning. Cora Bell, will you marry me?" Looking down at this man who'd fought for her, protected her, and chosen to stop running for the sake of their love, Cora felt her heart overflow with joy. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes." As Boone slipped the ring onto her finger, the assembled crowd erupted in cheers. Even Charlie Henderson was smiling, his earlier animosity forgotten in the face of such obvious happiness. The storm had passed, and the future stretched before them bright with possibility. 6 months later, the same church that had witnessed Cora's humiliation buzzed with excitement as she prepared to walk down the aisle once more. But this time, everything was different. This time, she wore a wedding dress of her own choosing, simple ivory silk that her neighbor women had helped her sew, adorned with lace that had belonged to her grandmother. This time, the man waiting at the altar had eyes only for her. Boone stood at the front of the church in his best clothesa dark suit that Emma Patterson had insisted on buying for him as a wedding gift. His hair was neatly trimmed, his beard shaped, but nothing could disguise the fundamental wildness that made him who he was. He looked, Cora thought with satisfaction, like a man who belonged to the frontier but had chosen to build something lasting within it. "Ready, daughter?" Samuel asked, offering her his arm. Her father had recovered much of his strength over the winter, bolstered by good food, reduced worry, and the satisfaction of watching his ranch prosper under Boone's careful management. "More than ready," Cora replied, adjusting the silver locket at her throat. Inside it now were 2 photographs your mother on one side and a small tintype of Boone on the other. Past and future united in the present moment. As they began their walk down the aisle, Cora marveled at how different this felt from her first attempt at matrimony. Then she'd been nervous, uncertain, playing a role she thought was expected of her. Now she felt complete, walking toward a future she'd chosen with clear eyes and an open heart. The church was packed with faces both familiar and surprising. Charlie Henderson sat in the third pew, his expression benevolent as he watched the woman his son had wanted marry the man she'd chosen instead. Thomas himself had surprised everyone by graciously accepting the situation, even going so far as to wish them happiness. Time and perspective, it seemed, had shown him that genuine love couldn't be forced or reasoned away. Emma Patterson dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Her grandson Timothy fully recovered from his injuries, fidgeting beside her in his Sunday best. The boy had become something of a local celebrity, telling anyone who'd listen about how Mr. Boone had saved his life with nothing but herbs and know-how. Even some of the soldiers who'd participated in Morrison's failed assault had remained in the area, drawn by work opportunities and the kind of community acceptance they'd never expected to find. Master Sergeant Collins now worked as the town's blacksmith, his military precision serving him well in his new trade. But it was Sheriff Wilson's presence that meant the most to both bride and groom. His investigation had not only cleared Boone's name, but had uncovered a web of corruption that reached far beyond Morrison's personal vendettas. The real stolen payroll had been recovered. Morrison was awaiting trial for multiple charges, and Boone's military record had been officially restored with full honors. As Cora reached the altar and placed her hand in Boone's, she felt the rightness of the moment settle into her bones. This was what her mother had felt, She realized not the giddy excitement of infatuation, but the deep satisfaction of recognizing your other half. Reverend Matthews began the ceremony with the traditional words, but Cora barely heard them. Her attention was focused entirely on the man beside her, on the gentle pressure of his fingers, and the love shining in his storm-grey eyes. "Do you, Boone Mackenzie, take Cora Elizabeth Bell to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do," Boone replied, his voice steady and sure. "With all my heart." "And do you, Cora Elizabeth Bell, take Boone Mackenzie to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," she said, the words carrying the weight of every choice that had brought her to this moment. "For better or worse, in prosperity and hardship, for as long as we both shall live." When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Boone's kiss was gentle but sure, a promise sealed before God and community. The congregation erupted in applause and cheers, but Cora heard it as if from a great distance. Her world had narrowed to this moment, this man, this new beginning. Later, at the reception held in the church's social hall, Cora found herself standing with Boone on the small porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The sounds of celebration drifted through the open window slaughter, music, the comfortable buzz of neighbors enjoying themselves. "No regrets?" Boone asked quietly, his arm around her waist. "Only that it took me so long to find you," Cora replied, leaning into his warmth. "What about you? Any second thoughts about giving up the wandering life?" Boone was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the horizon where the first stars were beginning to appear. "I spent 3 years running from my past," he said finally, "but I never ran toward anything until I found you. This, the ranch, the life we're building, this is worth fighting for." "Speaking of the ranch," Cora said with a smile, "I have news." "Oh?" "Dr. Morrison says I'm with child. We'll have a little one by next spring." Boone's reaction was everything she could have hoped, for pure joy mixed with wonder and a touch of protective concern. He placed his hand gently on her still, flat stomach, his fingers spreading wide, as if he could somehow shield their unborn child from every hardship the world might offer. "A baby," he whispered, "our baby. Are you pleased?" "Pleased?" Boone's laugh was rich with happiness. "Cora, I never thought I'd have a family of my own. After losing my grandmother, I figured I was meant to be alone. But you've given me everything I never dared to hope for." As they stood together watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, Cora thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had begun with heartbreak and defiance, with a woman scorned making an impulsive bid at a charity auction. But it had become something beautiful, a love story built on trust, respect, and the courage to choose hope over fear. The sounds of the celebration continued inside, but out here in the cool evening air, Mr. and Mrs. Boone Mackenzie simply held each other and planned their future. There would be challenges ahead there, always were for people brave enough to build something lasting. But they would face them together, and that made all the difference. In the distance, a nightbird called across the prairie, its song carrying on the wind like a blessing. Tomorrow would bring new work, new joys, new tests of the love they'd forged in fire and sealed in faith. But tonight, they were simply two hearts that had found their home in each other, and that was more than enough. The end,